The American Revolution. It began with farmers and tradesmen deciding that taxation without representation was worth dying over. And it ended with the most powerful empire on earth signing a document acknowledging it had lost to them. The war had dragged on for 8 years, longer than most colonists had imagined when the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord in April 1775. France's entry into the conflict in 1778 transformed a colonial rebellion into a global war that stretched British resources across multiple theaters simultaneously. The decisive moment came at Yorktown, Virginia in October 1781 when a combined American and French force trapped General Cornwallis's army on a peninsula with no escape route. After weeks of bombardment, Cornwallis surrendered his army of approximately 8,000 soldiers, the largest British force in America. Legend holds that the British band played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down" as the soldiers marched out to lay down their arms. The Treaty of Paris was signed in September 1783, with Britain formally recognizing American independence and ceding territory stretching to the Mississippi River. What had begun as a tax dispute had produced an entirely new nation, a governing philosophy that would reshape the world, and a British Empire that would spend decades processing the humiliation of losing its most valuable colonies to people it had always considered subjects. The Civil War. 4 years of industrial-scale slaughter ended in a farmhouse parlor in Virginia with 2 men sitting across a table from each other. Confederate General Robert E. Lee arrived at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, in his finest dress uniform, expecting to be arrested and possibly executed. Ulysses Grant arrived still covered in mud from riding through the night, and offered terms so generous they shocked everyone present. Confederate soldiers could go home, officers kept their sidearms, men who owned horses could keep them for spring planting. No trials, no firing squads, no revenge. The war had killed over 620,000 Americans, more than every other American conflict combined through Vietnam, and had consumed the entire economic and industrial capacity of the South in the process. 5 days after the surrender, Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater and died the following morning. Even then, the war technically continued. Confederate units in Texas had no idea Lee had surrendered and kept fighting for weeks. The last Confederate general to lay down arms did so on June 23rd, 2.5 months after Appomattox. The war ended slavery and preserved the Union. The man who had held it together never saw the peace he had fought for. The Spanish-American War. Few wars in American history began more dramatically or ended more consequentially for the world's balance of power. The USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor in February 1898, cause never definitively established, and American newspapers turned the incident into a declaration of war before the government had officially made one. The actual fighting lasted approximately 4 months. Theodore Roosevelt led his Rough Riders up San Juan Hill in Cuba. Commodore George Dewey destroyed the Spanish Pacific Fleet at Manila Bay in the Philippines in a single morning without losing a single American sailor. Spain, fighting simultaneously in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines with a navy that was outmatched in every theater, sued for peace. The Treaty of Paris, signed in December 1898, transferred Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to American control, transforming the United States from a continental power into a genuine imperial one, with territory spanning 2 oceans. The war that lasted 4 months reshaped the Western Hemisphere's political geography for the following century. World War I. America entered the First World War in April 1917, nearly 3 years after it had begun, and its industrial output and fresh manpower tipped a conflict that had ground a bloody stalemate across the Western Front. By the autumn of 1918, Germany's allies had collapsed one by one, and revolution was breaking out in German cities. Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. The new German government sent representatives to meet Allied Supreme Commander Ferdinand Foch in a railway carriage in the Compiègne forest at 5 a.m. on November 11, 1918. The armistice took effect 6 hours later, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. In those 6 hours between signing and ceasefire, both sides continued fighting and men continued dying right up to the final minute because nobody ordered them to stop early. The peace terms imposed at Versailles the following year stripped Germany of territory, imposed crippling reparations, and assigned solely war guilt to a country that had not started the war alone. Most historians trace a direct line from Versailles to the conditions that produced the Second World War 20 years later. World War II, Europe. Germany's unconditional surrender in May 1945 came in stages that reflected the complete disintegration of a regime that had been built around one man's will. Hitler died in his Berlin bunker on April 30th as Soviet forces fought street by street through the city above him. Admiral Karl Dönitz assumed what remained of German leadership and attempted to negotiate a partial surrender to Western forces while continuing to fight the Soviets, a stratagem the Allies refused. The formal surrender was signed in a schoolhouse in Rennes, France on May 7, 1945, with a second signing in Berlin the following day at Soviet insistence. VE Day, Victory in Europe, was celebrated across the Allied world with a relief so profound it bordered on disbelief. The war in Europe had killed an estimated 70 to 85 million people, destroyed entire cities, and produced atrocities whose documentation would take decades to fully process. The continent that had launched 2 world wars in 30 years was physically and morally shattered, and the American and Soviet forces that had liberated it from opposite directions now looked at each other across a divided continent and began preparing for the next conflict. World War II, Pacific. The night before Japan surrendered, a group of army officers stormed the Imperial Palace in Tokyo searching for a recording. Emperor Hirohito had taped a message announcing Japan's defeat, the first time any Japanese citizen would ever hear his voice, and the officers wanted to destroy it before it could be broadcast. They searched for hours, killed the commander of the Imperial Guard, and never found the recording, which had been hidden in a pile of laundry in a servant's quarters. By dawn, the coup had collapsed, and several officers knelt on the palace grounds and took their own lives. On August 15, 1945, Japan heard its emperor's voice for the first time announcing surrender. The formal signing took place September 2nd aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay in a ceremony MacArthur kept to exactly 18 minutes. Somewhere in the Philippine jungle, a Japanese soldier named Hiru Onoda heard nothing. He kept fighting until 1974, when his former commanding officer flew to the jungle and personally ordered him to stand down. He emerged in his original uniform and handed over his sword 29 years after the war had ended without him. Korea. The Korean War is the only major conflict of the 20th century that technically never ended. What was signed at Panmunjom on July 27, 1953 was not a peace treaty but an armistice, a temporary suspension of hostilities explicitly intended to remain in effect only until a final settlement could be reached. More than 70 years later, that settlement has not arrived. The war had begun in June 1950 when North Korean forces swept south and nearly pushed American and South Korean troops into the sea before MacArthur's amphibious landing at Incheon reversed the situation dramatically. Then 300,000 Chinese soldiers crossed the Yalu River and reversed it again. The front stabilized near where it had started, and for 2 more years men died fighting over frozen hills with names like Heartbreak Ridge, while armistice negotiations dragged on for 575 days. When the guns stopped, the border sat almost exactly where it had been when the war began. Over 36,000 Americans were dead. The 28,000 American troops still stationed along the DMZ today are the most visible reminder that the ceasefire never became a peace. Vietnam. America did not lose Vietnam in a single battle. It lost it over 20 years through a combination of strategic miscalculation, political dysfunction, and a fundamental misreading of what the conflict actually was. By April 1975, the question was no longer whether South Vietnam would fall, but how fast, and the answer was faster than anyone had planned for. On April 30th, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the Independence Palace in Saigon. The general who had been president for 43 hours sat waiting to transfer power. The North Vietnamese officer who walked in told him he had no power to transfer, only to surrender unconditionally. Meanwhile, the American evacuation had descended into chaos, with thousands of Vietnamese allies storming the embassy gates as helicopters lifted from the roof. The last helicopter left at 7:53 a.m., leaving behind people who had trusted American promises. Many spent years in re-education camps. The war that was supposed to stop communism ended with the country reunified under communist rule, exactly as its opponents had intended from the beginning. The Gulf War. The Gulf War is the rare American conflict that ended with something approaching a clean outcome, which is precisely why its conclusion has been debated ever since. Iraq invaded Kuwait in August 1990, and a 35-nation coalition spent 6 months building the largest military force assembled since World War II. The air campaign that began January 17, 1991, destroyed Iraq's command infrastructure within days. The ground war, launched February 24th, lasted exactly 100 hours. Coalition forces swept through Iraqi positions with a speed that overwhelmed units considered battle-hardened after 8 years of war with Iran. President George H.W. Bush declared a ceasefire on February 28th and made the deliberate decision to stop at Kuwait's border rather than push to Baghdad, a decision made with clear reasoning about the consequences of removing the Iraqi government that was criticized extensively when American forces invaded Iraq 12 years later and encountered exactly the complications that 1991 decision had been designed to avoid. Afghanistan. America's longest war ended on August 30th, 2021, with the last American military aircraft lifting off from Kabul airport and the Taliban controlling more of Afghanistan than they had when the war began 20 years earlier. The conflict had started in October 2001, weeks after September 11th, with the explicit goal of destroying al-Qaeda and removing the Taliban government that had sheltered them. The Taliban were driven from power within months. Then the mission expanded, the years accumulated, the troop numbers fluctuated, the strategies changed, and successive administrations inherited a war none of them knew how to end without admitting failure. The final collapse came faster than American officials had publicly predicted. The Afghan government the United States had spent 2 decades and $2 trillion building dissolved in days as Taliban forces advanced. The evacuation of Kabul produced scenes of desperate crowds at the airport, people clinging to departing aircraft, and 13 American service members killed in a bombing at the airport gate. The war that was supposed to last weeks lasted 20 years and ended with the country governed by the same movement American forces had removed at the beginning. If you made it this far, drop a comment below and let us know which war you want us to cover next. Subscribe so you never miss an upload. There's a lot more where this came from.